Hello everyone. Welcome back to Eternal Archives, a place where we slow things down, let the noise of the day fade, and wander quietly through the worlds that history left behind. Before we begin, take a moment for yourself. Get comfortable. Maybe dim the lights. If there's a fan nearby, let it hum softly in the background. When you're ready, let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing slow, and allow your thoughts to drift away from the present. Tonight, we're traveling back more than 3,000 years to a world balanced on the edge of collapse. Long before the classical empires of Greece and Rome, before iron weapons reshaped warfare, before history learned to write itself clearly, there existed a fragile, interconnected Bronze Age world. This was a time when kingdoms rose along rivers and coastlines. Egypt, still powerful under its pharaohs. The Hittite Empire, ruling vast lands from Anatolia. Mycenaean city-states dominating the Aegean. Merchant ports thrived across the eastern Mediterranean, linked by trade routes that carried copper, tin, grain, wine, and ideas. Ships crossed the seas constantly. Messengers traveled between courts. Royal families were bound together by marriage. Treaties were written, sealed, and respected. It was a world that believed itself stable, civilized, permanent. Cities were fortified but confident. Palaces were filled with scribes, musicians, and administrators. Storehouses overflowed with grain. Armies existed, but war was formal, seasonal, controlled. And then something began to move. At first, it was barely noticed. A disruption in trade here, a coastal raid there. Rumors carried by sailors who spoke of strange ships on the horizon. People arriving from the sea. No clear homeland. No king known by name. No cities to negotiate with. Only movement. Only pressure. By the time the great powers realized what was happening, it was already too late. Cities burned. Ports were abandoned. Entire kingdoms vanished from the record. Egyptian scribes would later carve desperate scenes into stone. Battles against invaders arriving by ship. Men, women, and long before the classical empires of Greece and Rome, before iron weapons reshaped warfare, before history learned to write itself clearly, there existed a fragile, interconnected Bronze Age world. This was a time when kingdoms rose along rivers and coastlines. Egypt still stood powerful under its pharaohs, its temples lining the Nile. The Hittite Empire ruled vast lands from Anatolia, bound together by roads, treaties, and chariots. Mycenaean city-states dominated the Aegean, their stone palaces overlooking the sea. Merchant ports thrived across the eastern Mediterranean, linked by trade routes that carried copper, tin, grain, wine, and ideas. Ships crossed the seas constantly. Messengers traveled between courts. Royal families were connected by marriage. Treaties were written, sealed, and respected. It was a world that believed itself stable, civilized, permanent. Cities were fortified but confident. Palaces were filled with scribes, musicians, and administrators. Storehouses overflowed with grain. Armies existed, but war was formal, seasonal, controlled. Even conflict followed rules. The sea was not feared. It was trusted. Along the coasts, life moved to rhythms older than writing. Fishing villages, narrow harbors, beaches where ships were dragged onto sand by hand. These coastal societies were not weak, but they were rarely counted among the great kings. They lived in the margins of history. Sailors, traders, raiders, families bound to the water. And then, slowly at first, the world began to fracture. Letters from kings grew anxious. Trade shipments stopped arriving. Cities reported unrest, shortages, unfamiliar ships on the horizon. In Egypt, scribes recorded rumors of foreign peoples moving together, entire groups, not just warriors, men, women, children, carts, livestock, ships traveling not for trade, but for survival, or conquest, or something harder to define. The old balance began to crack. At first, it was barely noticed. A disruption in trade here, a coastal raid there, rumors carried by sailors who spoke of strange ships on the horizon, people arriving from the sea. No clear homeland, no king known by name, no cities to negotiate with. Only movement, only pressure. And by the time the great powers realized something was truly wrong, the world they depended on was already... The world you are about to enter is older than empires most people remember. This is the Late Bronze Age, a time when the great powers of the ancient world still stood firm. Egypt ruled the Nile with confidence, its grain fields feeding cities and armies alike. Pharaohs believed their authority reflected the order of the universe itself. To the north, the Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia, bound together by fortified cities, chariot armies, and treaties carved into stone. Across the sea, Mycenaean kings ruled from massive palaces, their storerooms filled with bronze weapons, oil, wine, and grain. Trade connected everything. Tin traveled from distant lands, copper came from Cyprus. Together they formed bronze, the foundation of tools, weapons, and power. Ships crossed the Mediterranean constantly, moving goods, messengers, and ideas. Kings wrote letters to one another on clay tablets, calling each other brother. Alliances were sealed through marriage. Even war followed rules. To the people living in this world, it felt stable, predictable, permanent. But stability in the ancient world was always fragile. Beyond palace walls and royal records, pressure was building. Droughts stretched longer than expected. Harvests failed in some regions. Earthquakes cracked cities thought eternal. When food became scarce, unrest followed. When trade slowed, weapons could not be replaced. When a single route failed, entire regions felt the strain. And then, slowly, movement began. Not armies marching under banners, not kings with envoys. People. Coastal communities abandoned failing lands. Sailors prepared ships not for trade, but for survival. Families loaded what they could carry. Warriors followed them, men who knew how to fight, how to board ships, how to live without a homeland to return to. At first, the great powers barely noticed. A port attacked here, a ship lost there, coastal raids dismissed as piracy. There had always been pirates, there had always been unrest. But this was different. These newcomers did not strike once and disappear forever. They returned. They landed in numbers. They pushed inland. Some cities were not just looted, they were erased, burned and abandoned, never rebuilt. Messages began circulating between kings. Letters grew urgent. One ruler. The first signs of collapse did not come as a single disaster. They came quietly. A shipment of tin delayed longer than expected. A letter from a king asking for grain instead of gold. A coastal town reporting unfamiliar ships on the horizon, then falling silent. At first, these were treated as problems with explanations. Bad weather, local unrest, piracy, nothing more. But the disruptions began to stack. Across Anatolia and the Levant, droughts stretched from one season into the next. Fields that had fed generations produced less each year. Granaries emptied faster than they could be refilled. Farmers abandoned land that no longer sustained them, moving towards cities already under strain. Earthquakes struck without warning. Entire ports cracked apart. Walls collapsed. Harbors filled with rubble. Cities that depended on maritime trade found themselves cut off overnight. And trade, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, began to fail. Tin became scarce. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Without bronze, weapons dulled, tools broke, and armies weakened. Kings wrote desperate letters to one another. Some asked for grain. Some asked for soldiers. Some asked if the rumors were true. Many of those letters were never answered. In places like Ugarit, a wealthy port city on the Syrian coast, the final messages still survive. The king writes urgently that enemy ships have been sighted. His defenses are unprepared. He begs for help. Help never comes. The city burns. Its palaces collapse. Its archives are buried beneath ash. Those clay tablets survive only because the fire bakes them into stone. Across the Mediterranean, the pattern repeats. Mycenaean palaces are abandoned. Hittite strongholds fall silent. Trade routes that existed for centuries vanish in a single generation. And through this growing instability, movement begins. Not armies marching under banners, not kings declaring war. People. Entire groups begin to move along the coastlines and across the sea. Men, women, children, warriors and families together. Ships no longer carrying trade goods, but possessions, livestock and weapons. They are not coming to negotiate. They are not coming to trade. They are coming because staying where they are is no. As the pressure builds across the Bronze Age world, the sea peoples begin to appear more clearly, not as a single army, but as multiple groups moving at once. Egyptian records list different names: the Shurden, the Peliset, the Shekelesh, the Denyen. each with distinct clothing, shields, and fighting styles. This was not one nation rising. It was many peoples moving together under shared desperation. They did not fight like the great palace armies. They did not rely on chariots, rigid formations, or long supply lines. Instead, they fought as heavy infantry, trained for close combat. Their shields were round or oval, made of wood and leather, reinforced at the center. Their primary weapons were long thrusting spears and short stabbing swords, designed for tight spaces, ship decks, narrow streets, city gates. At sea, their ships were fast and shallow. They could land directly on beaches instead of harbors. This meant no warning, no time to prepare defenses. Warriors could disembark, form ranks, and advance inland before messengers even reached nearby cities. Naval battles were not decided by ramming, but by boarding. Ships locked together, fighters crossed over. Battles became brutal, close, and personal, with waves rocking beneath their feet. On land, they favored speed and pressure. Rather than long sieges, they struck quickly, overwhelming defenses before organized resistance could form. Coastal towns fell first, ports burned, supply routes vanished. Cities that depended on imported grain or metal collapsed almost overnight. Most importantly, they did not move alone. Egyptian reliefs show women, children, carts, and livestock traveling alongside warriors. This was not raiding for profit. This was migration under arms. Victory meant land. Defeat meant extinction. There was no retreat to a homeland that still existed. For the great Bronze Age kingdoms, this kind of warfare was devastating. Armies trained for open field battles found themselves useless against enemies who refused to fight by the time the Sea Peoples begin to appear clearly in the historical record, they are not inexperienced raiders. They are already veterans of violence, movement, and survival. They do not fight like the great armies of Egypt or the chariot forces of the Hittites. Their strength comes from speed, coordination, and close combat, not from rigid formations or long supply lines. Most Sea Peoples fought as heavy infantry. Egyptian reliefs and archaeological evidence show warriors carrying large, round, or oval shields made of wood and leather, often reinforced at the center. These shields were wide enough to protect the body, but light enough to move quickly. Behind them came long thrusting spears, designed not for throwing, but for driving forward in tight formations, breaking enemy lines and forcing close engagement. Once formations collapsed, short swords followed. These were leaf-shaped or straight blades made for stabbing rather than slashing, deadly in narrow spaces like ship decks, city streets, and gatehouses. This was not elegant warfare. It was exhausting, personal, and brutal. Their helmets were distinctive. Some wore horned helmets. Others used crested headgear made of leather and bronze. These were not ceremonial. The horns and crests helped identify allies in chaotic fighting and made warriors appear taller and more intimidating in close combat. Psychological impact mattered when battles were decided face to face. At sea, the Sea Peoples did not rely on ramming like later navies. Instead, their ships closed distance quickly. Grappling hooks and boarding tactics turned naval combat into infantry combat on floating platforms. Once ships were locked together, numbers, aggression, and discipline mattered more than ship design. Egyptian reliefs show warriors fighting hand-to-hand on rocking decks, shields raised as waves crashed beneath them. On land, they avoided long sieges. Rather than surrounding cities for months, they struck fast. Coastal settlements were hit before defenders could fully mobilize. Ports were burned, storehouses emptied. Entire communities were displaced. Speed allowed them to attack multiple targets along the coast, leaving destruction behind and moving on before organized armies could. By the time the Sea Peoples appear clearly in the historical record, the world they are entering is already under immense strain. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the great Bronze Age powers are weakening from within. Years of unreliable harvests have strained food supplies. Drought has dried fields that once fed entire regions. Earthquakes have damaged ports, walls, and palaces that were never rebuilt. Trade routes that once moved metal and grain with precision now fail without warning. Bronze itself becomes a problem. Tin, essential for making bronze, grows scarce. Without tin, weapons cannot be replaced. Tools break and remain broken. Armies lose their edge not because they are defeated in battle, but because they can no longer equip themselves properly. Kings still command power in name, but their ability to act is slipping away. It is in this fractured world that the Sea Peoples thrive. They are not bound to palace economies or rigid supply systems. They do not rely on long caravans or distant alliances. Their strength lies in mobility. Ships replace roads. The sea becomes their network. Where empires depend on stability, the Sea Peoples adapt to instability. Egyptian reliefs show them arriving with families and possessions, not just warriors. This suggests that these were not temporary raids, but movements of entire communities. Men fought while women and children followed behind in carts and ships. Livestock traveled with them. What they sought was not only plunder, but land, food, and survival. Their warfare reflects this reality. They favor sudden coastal landings rather than long campaigns. Ships beach themselves quickly. Warriors disembark in force. Defenders, trained to face threats from inland borders, are caught unprepared. Before an organized response can form, the fighting is already underway. Once inside a settlement, the battle becomes brutal and close. Shield presses, spears drive forward. Short swords are used where space is tight and panic spreads. There is no formal withdrawal, no orderly retreat. Victory means taking what is needed and moving on. Defeat means annihilation. This is not conquest in the traditional sense. It is pressure applied again and again across dozens of locations until systems collapse under their own weight. As the sea peoples move, they leave behind burned ports, abandoned cities, and broken trade routes. Each destruction weakens neighboring regions. Each failure feeds the next wave of movement. Collapse spreads faster than any army ever could. And still, no single ruler understands what they are facing. Because there is no capital to attack, no king to negotiate with, no treaty that can stop a people who have nowhere left to go. The Bronze Age world is no longer breaking, it is giving way. By the time the Sea Peoples appear clearly in the historical record, they are already experienced fighters. These are not desperate villagers picking up weapons for the first time. They move with confidence, coordination, and an understanding of violence shaped by years of survival along unstable coastlines. They do not fight like the great palace armies of the Bronze Age. Egyptian and Hittite forces rely heavily on chariots, archers, and rigid formations controlled by officers and messengers. That system works best on open ground, with preparation, supply lines, and predictable campaigns. The Sea Peoples break those assumptions. Their strength lies in infantry combat and shock. Most fight on foot, carrying large, round or oval shields made of wood and leather, reinforced at the center. These shields are not ceremonial. They are built to absorb impact and push forward. Behind them, warriors carry long thrusting spears used to keep enemies at distance and break formations. Once lines collapse, short swords and daggers take over, designed for stabbing in tight spaces. This style of fighting is brutal and exhausting, but extremely effective in close quarters. At sea, their tactics are just as direct. Rather than relying on ramming or long-range missile exchanges, their ships close quickly. Grappling hooks and boarding actions turn naval combat into infantry combat on unstable decks. Once ships are locked together, the fight becomes personal. Shields colliding, spears driving forward, bodies struggling for footing as waves rock beneath them. Egyptian reliefs show this clearly. Battles are not neat lines of ships. They are chaotic masses of men fighting hand to hand, falling into the water, climbing over wreckage, dragging enemies down with them. On land, they avoid the collapse of the Bronze Age did not happen in a single year or from a single cause. It unfolded slowly, then all at once. Across the eastern Mediterranean, systems that had held for centuries began to fail together. Long periods of drought reduced harvests. Letters from kings speak openly of famine, of cities begging neighbors for grain that never arrived. Earthquakes damaged ports, walls, and storehouses. Trade routes became unreliable. When ships stopped coming, entire regions felt it within weeks. Bronze itself became a problem. Tin, already rare, was harder to acquire as trade networks collapsed. Without tin, bronze weapons could not be replaced. Armies weakened, tools dulled. Palaces that relied on constant supply suddenly found themselves unable to sustain soldiers or workers. For the Sea Peoples, This collapse was not theoretical, it was immediate. If they had once been sailors, traders, mercenaries, or coastal communities tied to palace economies, those systems no longer supported them. Contracts vanished, food shortages spread, entire populations were forced to move or starve. Migration became survival. This pressure reshaped how they fought. Rather than formal campaigns, warfare became fast and opportunistic. Ports were prime targets, not because of glory, but because they held grain, metal, ships, and access inland. A single successful coastal attack could feed a group for months. Cities dependent on imports were especially vulnerable. When harbors burned, inland regions followed. Egyptian reliefs show something unusual for warfare of this time. Families moving alongside fighters, carts carrying possessions, women and children present near the early Iron Age. The world that had produced the sea peoples no longer existed. The great palace economies of the Bronze Age were gone. The long trade routes that once carried tin, copper, and grain across the Mediterranean had collapsed. Cities that depended on imported food and metal were abandoned or reduced to small settlements. Writing disappeared in some regions for centuries. Kings no longer called one another brother. The old diplomatic world was finished. And in this new world, there was no place for roaming fleets of warrior migrants. Iron weapons began to replace bronze. Iron was harder to work, but easier to find. States that survived reorganized their armies around new technologies and tighter borders. Fortifications were redesigned. Coastal defenses improved. The chaos that once allowed sudden landings and rapid strikes slowly faded. For the sea peoples, this meant the end of their way of life. Some groups settled permanently. They farmed land instead of raiding coasts. They built homes instead of ships. Over generations, their languages, customs, and identities blended into the regions they settled. Others became mercenaries, sailors, or soldiers for new kingdoms that rose from the ruins of the old. They did not disappear in a single battle. They disappeared by becoming ordinary. History remembers kings, cities, and empires because they leave records. The sea peoples left almost none of their own. What we know of them comes from enemies who survived long enough to carve warnings into stone, from cities burned and never rebuilt, from gaps where writing suddenly stops. They were not a single people. By the time the sea peoples begin to appear clearly in the historical record, the Bronze Age world is already under strain. This is important to understand. They did not arrive to destroy a strong, healthy system. They arrived at a moment when that system was already weakening. Across the eastern Mediterranean, harvests were becoming unreliable. Climate evidence suggests long periods of drought in Anatolia and the Levant. Rivers that once fed cities failed to flood as expected. Fields produced less grain. Food shortages spread quietly at first, then openly. Letters from this period survive, written by kings begging neighboring rulers for grain to prevent starvation. At the same time, earthquakes struck key regions. Archaeological layers show cities collapsing suddenly, their walls cracked, their harbors damaged. Ports that once handled constant trade were left unusable. Roads fell into disrepair, communication slowed. Trade routes, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age, began to fail. Tin shipments stopped arriving. Without tin, bronze could not be made. Weapons dulled, tools broke. Armies that depended on constant resupply weakened quickly. Chariots, once the symbol of elite power, became expensive liabilities that could not be maintained. For many people living along the coasts, this collapse meant one thing: survival was no longer guaranteed. When fields failed and trade disappeared, communities were forced to move. Some moved inland, others turned to the sea. Ships that once carried cargo now carried families. Fishermen became sailors, sailors became warriors. Groups merged together, bound not by kings or borders, but by necessity. This is likely where many of the sea peoples emerged. They were not born as an invading empire. They were shaped by collapse, by hunger, by displacement, by the failure of systems they depended on but did not control. And when enough people are pushed at once, movement becomes unstoppable. The Sea Peoples did not invent the Bronze Age collapse, but they moved through it like a blade through weakened armor, turning strain into catastrophe wherever they landed. As the Bronze Age continued to collapse, the world that had allowed the Sea Peoples to exist began to disappear beneath them. The great palace economies were gone. The storehouses that once held grain, weapons, and tribute had burned. Trade routes that connected copper, tin, and food across the Mediterranean no longer functioned. Ports were destroyed or abandoned. Ships had fewer safe harbors to land in. The very systems the Sea Peoples had exploited were now gone. This changed everything. For generations, mobility had been an advantage. Being able to move by sea, strike quickly, and avoid long sieges allowed them to survive in a world of collapsing states. But once the collapse became total, there was less to raid, less to take, and fewer places left to go. Some groups settled. Egyptian records suggest that certain Sea Peoples were allowed or forced to settle in controlled regions after being defeated. The Peliset, often linked to the Philistines, appear to have established themselves along the southern Levantine coast. Archaeology shows new pottery styles, new architecture, and new cultural blends emerging in these areas. Former raiders became farmers, traders, and soldiers of new local powers. Other groups likely dissolved completely. Without centralized leadership, written records, or a homeland to preserve identity, many sea peoples were absorbed into surrounding populations. Intermarriage, settlement, and time erased distinctions. What had once been a coalition of migrating warbands slowly became ordinary communities. And history, written by states and scribes, moved on. As the Iron Age began, warfare changed. Iron weapons became more common and easier to produce than bronze. Armies reorganized, borders hardened. States adapted to a harsher, less interconnected world. The conditions that had allowed the sea peoples to thrive no longer existed. They did not vanish in a final battle. They vanished by becoming part of the world they had helped reshape. Farmers instead of raiders, settlers instead of sailors, names forgotten as generations passed. What remains are fragments, burned cities, collapsed trade routes, reliefs carved by enemies trying to explain disaster. The sea peoples were never a single nation. They were a reaction to collapse, a movement created by pressure, scarcity, and survival. When the sea peoples did not appear out of nowhere, they emerged from a world already under strain. By the late Bronze Age, the systems that held civilizations together were failing all at once. Long trade routes became unreliable. Tin shipments slowed or stopped entirely. Without tin, bronze could not be made, and without bronze, weapons dulled, tools broke, and armies weakened. Cities that depended on imported grain faced shortages. Storehouses emptied faster than they could be refilled. Climate shifts made everything worse. Droughts stretched on for years instead of seasons. Harvests failed. Inland populations began moving toward the coasts, placing pressure on port cities already struggling to survive. Earthquakes damaged harbors and palace centers, sometimes destroying cities overnight. Rebuilding required resources that no longer existed. For mobile, sea-oriented groups, this collapse created opportunity. The sea peoples were not tied to palace economies or fixed farmlands. They did not depend on long supply chains or written bureaucracy. Their strength was movement. Ships could relocate entire communities. Weapons could be carried rather than stored. Food could be taken where it still existed. As kingdoms weakened, defenses grew inconsistent. Garrisons went unpaid. Patrols became rare. Ports that once felt secure became exposed. A single successful attack could feed dozens of ships and hundreds of people. One burning harbor could cripple an entire region inland. And so the sea peoples moved. Not in one wave, but in many. Some groups attacked, others followed. Some settled briefly, then moved again. Their actions fed the collapse rather than causing it alone. Each raid weakened trade further. Each destroyed city removed another node from the system holding the Bronze Age together. This is why they seem to appear everywhere at once. Not because they were unstoppable, but because the world they entered could no longer hold. As the old powers fell, the sea peoples did not inherit an empire. They inherited ruins. The collapse of the Bronze Age did not end when the fires stopped burning. It continued quietly in the years that followed as the old world failed to rebuild itself. For centuries, Bronze Age power had depended on complexity, long trade routes, centralized palaces, scribes, storehouses, and armies supplied by distant resources. When those systems collapsed, there was no quick way to restore them. Tin no longer arrived. Bronze weapons could not be replaced. Writing disappeared in many regions, not because people forgot how to write, but because the institutions that required writing were gone. For the Sea Peoples, this new world offered fewer opportunities than the one they had helped shatter. The great cities that once held wealth, food, and metal were ruined or abandoned. Ports lay silent. Trade routes no longer connected distant regions. Raiding became less profitable, and long migrations by sea grew more dangerous without safe harbors to rely on. Some groups adapted by settling. Egyptian records suggest that parts of the Sea Peoples were absorbed into local populations. Along the southern Levantine coast, the Peliset appear to have established permanent communities, blending their traditions with those of the land they entered. Over time, they became something new, no longer Sea Peoples, but inhabitants of a changing world. Other groups likely dissolved entirely. Without a centralized identity, written language, or homeland, their names vanished as generations passed. Warriors became farmers. Sailors became laborers. Children grew up without knowing the stories of the migrations that had once carried their families across the sea. History remembers what leaves records behind: kingdoms, laws, temples, inscriptions carved into stone. The Sea Peoples left very little of this. What we know of them comes almost entirely from their enemies. From Egyptian reliefs showing desperate battles, from burned layers of destroyed cities, from sudden silences in the archaeological record. They did not disappear because they were defeated in a final battle. They disappeared because the world that created them no longer existed. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation, and they were not invincible. They were a response to pressure, to famine, collapse, and instability. When those pressures shifted, so did they. They became part of the next age, even if history no longer remembered their name. The Bronze Age ended not with a single fall, but with a long unraveling. And the Sea Peoples were both a symptom of that unraveling and one of its accelerants. When systems break, people move. When movement becomes... The collapse of the Bronze Age did not end when the fires stopped burning. It continued quietly in the years that followed as the old world failed to rebuild itself. For centuries, Bronze Age power had depended on complexity, long trade routes, centralized palaces, scribes, storehouses, and armies supplied by distant resources. When those systems collapsed, there was no quick way to restore them. Tin no longer arrived. Bronze weapons could not be replaced. Writing disappeared in many regions, not because people forgot how to write, but because the institutions that required writing were gone. For the Sea Peoples, this new world offered fewer opportunities than the one they had helped shatter. The great cities that once held wealth, food, and metal were ruined or abandoned. Ports lay silent. Trade routes no longer connected distant regions. Raiding became less profitable, and long migrations by sea grew more dangerous without safe harbors to rely on. Some groups adapted by settling. Egyptian records suggest that parts of the Sea Peoples were absorbed into local populations. Along the southern Levantine coast, the Peliset appear to have established permanent communities, blending their traditions with those of the land they entered. Over time, they became something new, no longer sea peoples, but inhabitants of a changing world. Other groups likely dissolved entirely. Without a centralized identity, written language, or homeland, their names vanished as generations passed. Warriors became farmers. Sailors became laborers. Children grew up without knowing the stories of the migrations that had once carried their families across the sea. History remembers what leaves records behind: kingdoms, laws, temples, inscriptions carved into stone. The Sea Peoples left very little of this. What we know of them comes almost entirely from their enemies, from Egyptian reliefs showing desperate battles, from burned layers of destroyed cities, from sudden silences in the archaeological record. They did not disappear because they were defeated in a final battle. They disappeared because the world that created them no longer existed. The Sea Peoples were not a single nation, and they were not invincible. They were a response to pressure, to famine, collapse, and instability. When those pressures shifted, so did they. They became part of the next age, even if history no longer remembered their name. The Bronze Age ended not with a single fall, but with a long unraveling, and the Sea Peoples were both a symptom of that unraveling and one of its accelerants. When systems break, people move. When movement becomes survival, war follows. And when the world changes, those who adapt quietly endure, even if history forgets them. As the Bronze Age world collapsed, the Sea Peoples did not escape the chaos they helped accelerate. The same forces that broke kingdoms also caught up to them. Trade networks vanished, ports burned. The palace economies that once stored grain, bronze, and weapons were gone. Without them, there was no longer enough wealth to sustain large-scale movement or warfare. For generations, the Sea Peoples had relied on speed, coordination, and access to coastal resources. But as cities fell and coastlines emptied, there was less to raid and fewer places left to go. Ships that once moved freely between thriving ports now found only ruins, abandoned harbors, and hostile shores. Some groups adapted by settling. Egyptian records suggest that certain Sea Peoples were allowed to remain in controlled regions after being defeated, forced to farm, serve as laborers, or fight as mercenaries. Others established permanent communities along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, blending with local populations over time. Their weapons changed, their way of life slowed, their identities began to fade. Without centralized leadership, written records, or a homeland to preserve memory, the Sea Peoples disappeared from history not through destruction, but through absorption. They became farmers instead of raiders, sailors instead of warriors, locals instead of outsiders. By the early Iron Age, the world had changed again. New powers rose. Iron replaced bronze, armies reorganized, borders hardened. The conditions that once allowed mobile warbands to dominate were gone. The sea peoples did not vanish in a single moment. They dissolved into the world they had helped reshape. And because history is written by states, kings, and scribes, their story survives only in fragments, in Egyptian reliefs carved by enemies, in burned layers beneath ancient cities, in sudden silences where trade records once existed. They were not monsters. They were not a single nation. They were people caught in a collapsing system. When worlds break, people move. When resources disappear, survival takes new paths. And when enough pressure builds, even the strongest civilizations can fall. The sea peoples did not escape the destruction they helped accelerate. The same forces that shattered empires, drought, famine, failing trade networks, and political breakdown, also closed in on them. The great palace economies that once stored grain, bronze, and weapons disappeared. Ports that had fed fleets burned or were abandoned. Tin became scarce. Ships had fewer safe harbors. Even victory became unsustainable. Some groups settled where they could. Egyptian records suggest that certain sea peoples were allowed to settle under supervision, absorbed into frontier regions as soldiers or laborers. Others established themselves permanently along the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Peleset, often linked to the Philistines, appear to have formed new communities in the southern Levant, building cities, farming land, and slowly becoming something else entirely. Other groups vanished more quietly. Without centralized leadership, without writing systems of their own, and without a homeland to anchor their identity, many sea peoples were absorbed into surrounding populations. Warriors became farmers. Sailors became merchants. Children grew up speaking new languages, worshipping new gods, and forgetting the migrations that had once defined their people. And because history is written by states, by kings, by scribes, by surviving institutions, the sea peoples fade from the record. They do not disappear in a final battle. They dissolve. Their names survive only in fragments, carved into Egyptian stone by enemies trying to explain catastrophe, preserved in layers of ash where cities once stood, echoed in sudden silences where trade records stop. The sea peoples were not monsters. They were not a single nation. They were not a unified empire. They were a symptom. When systems fail, people move. When resources vanish, survival reshapes societies. And when enough pressure builds, even the most powerful worlds can break. The Bronze Age did not end with a single invasion. It ended through collapse, migration, and change carried across the sea. And in that turning age, the sea peoples were both victims and accelerants, human beings caught in the current of a world coming apart. The Bronze Age world continued to collapse. The Sea Peoples did not stand outside that destruction. They were caught inside it. The same forces that weakened empires also worked against them. Trade networks that once offered targets began to disappear. Ports were abandoned. Cities that once held grain, bronze, and wealth lay burned or empty. The sea routes that carried opportunity now carried uncertainty. For groups built around movement, this was a turning point. Some sea peoples found land worth staying on. Along the southern Levant, groups like the Peliset appear to have settled permanently. Archaeology shows new styles of pottery, housing, and weapons blending with local traditions. These were no longer fleets in motion, but communities trying to survive in a changed world. Others were absorbed quietly. Former warriors became farmers. Sailors became laborers or mercenaries for emerging powers. Without palaces, scribes, or written records of their own, their identities faded within a generation or two. They did not disappear through defeat. They disappeared through assimilation. The world itself had changed. The Bronze Age system that once made mobility powerful no longer existed. Iron began to replace bronze. Local production mattered more than long trade routes. States reorganized their armies around infantry and fortified borders. Movement without territory became less effective. Raiding without stable supply grew dangerous. The Sea Peoples did not fall in a final battle. There was no last stand recorded in stone. Instead, they dissolved into the new age they helped create. History remembers them only because others feared them enough to carve their names into monuments. Egyptian reliefs show them as enemies at the gate. Burned cities preserve their impact in layers of ash. But their own voices are gone. They were not a single nation. They were not a unified empire. They were people responding to pressure. When systems fail, people move. When resources vanish, survival becomes migration. And when enough people are forced into motion at once, the world reshapes itself. The Sea Peoples were not the end of the Bronze Age on their own, but they were the force that revealed how fragile that world had become. And once it broke, there was no going back. As the Bronze Age collapsed, the Sea Peoples were not spared by the chaos they helped unleash. The same forces that shattered kingdoms, drought, famine, broken trade routes, internal revolts, and population pressure, eventually closed in on them as well. The palace economies that once stored grain, bronze, and weapons disappeared. Ports burned, harbors fell silent. Long-distance trade routes that had fed both empires and raiders alike no longer functioned. There was less to take. less to raid, less to fight over. Some groups settled where they could. Egyptian records suggest that parts of the Sea Peoples were absorbed into local populations. The Paliset, often linked to the Philistines, appear to have established themselves along the southern Levantine coast. Others likely merged into Aegean, Anatolian, or Mediterranean communities, losing their distinct identity over time. Without centralized leadership, without writing systems of their own, and without a homeland to preserve their memory, the Sea Peoples faded from history as a named force. They did not vanish in a single battle. They vanished by becoming ordinary, by farming instead of raiding, by settling instead of sailing, by being absorbed into the very world they once disrupted. And because history is written by states, by kings and by scribes, not by wandering fleets, their story survives only in fragments, in Egyptian reliefs carved by enemies, in layers of ash buried beneath ruined cities, in broken trade records and sudden silences. The Sea Peoples were not monsters. They were not a single nation. They were a symptom of a world under pressure. When systems fail, people move. When resources disappear, survival takes new paths. And when enough pressure builds at once, even the most powerful civilizations can fall. The Bronze Age did not end quietly. It ended through collapse, movement, and fire carried across the sea. As the noise of the modern world returns, take a moment to sit with that thought. Civilizations feel permanent while we live inside them. History reminds us that even the strongest systems can fracture when stress builds for too long. This was the world of the Sea Peoples, warriors shaped by migration, desperation, and change. Not conquerors of empires, but catalysts in a turning age. If stories like this help you slow down, reflect, and see the past with fresh eyes, you're in the right place. Welcome to Eternal Archives. Thank you for listening.